I'll never forget that unforgettable road trip we took when I was younger. My family and I were headed to Yellowstone National Park, a jaw-droppingly beautiful place you simply have to experience for yourself. The park, with its geysers, hot springs, and abundant wildlife, had been on our bucket list for years. We embarked on the long journey from our home in sunny California, a 17-hour drive in our trusty Yukon XL. It took us several days of on-again, off-again driving, stopping at quaint motels and campgrounds along the way to rest for the night. One particular night, we were running behind schedule, so my dad decided to push through and drive into the early hours of the morning. He was determined to reach our next stop before daybreak, but eventually he realized it was unsafe to continue due to fatigue. He pulled over at a small, unlit rest stop nestled within a dense forest. My brothers and I had already dozed off, so we all slept in the car, parked in this secluded dark lot surrounded by an eerie canopy of trees. When I woke up later that night, my body contorted in an uncomfortable position. I found myself disoriented, but not frightened. The car was pitch black, with everyone else still fast asleep. I felt isolated and restless, unable to drift back into slumber. Boredom slowly crept in, and I decided to investigate our surroundings. Peering out the window, I couldn't see a thing in the darkness enveloping the forest. Thankfully, I had always been a Boy Scout at heart and had packed a couple of flashlights for the trip. I carefully reached into the back seat, grabbed a small yellow flashlight from my bag, and switched it on. Pressing my face against the cold glass, I scanned the tree line, searching for any signs of life or interesting landmarks. At first, it seemed like an ordinary forest, bushes, trees, and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. But then I spotted a dark, motionless figure between two trees in the distance. It appeared to be a man, but something about it seemed off. The figure was tall and unnaturally thin, standing unnervingly still. I kept watching, trying to convince myself it was just a bush or some natural formation. My heartbeat quickened, and I held my breath, hoping for some logical explanation. As I was about to switch off the flashlight and try to sleep again, the shadowy figure suddenly rotated 90 degrees and disappeared behind a tree. I couldn't believe my eyes. Panic surged through me, and I quickly turned off the flashlight, pulling my makeshift sweater blanket over my head. My heart pounded in my chest as I huddled in a semi-fetal position, clutching the flashlight tightly. The darkness of the car felt suffocating, and I struggled to take deep, calming breaths. Questions raced through my mind. What was that figure? Was it human? Was it dangerous? I remained frozen in terror, adrenaline preventing me from getting any more sleep that night. I could hear the sounds of the forest around me, each snapping twig or rustling leaf amplifying my fear. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as I lay there, my thoughts consumed by the mysterious figure and the unknown dangers it could pose. As the hours crept by, I tried to rationalize the situation. Maybe it was just a hunter, I thought, or a hiker who had lost their way. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something otherworldly about the encounter. I held onto the flashlight like a lifeline, knowing that it was the only thing standing between me and the all-consuming darkness of the forest. Eventually, the first hints of daylight began to filter through the trees, casting a grayish hue over the once pitch-black landscape. My family members slowly stirred, yawning and stretching as they awoke from their slumber, oblivious to my night of terror. My heart rate gradually returned to normal, but I couldn't shake the lingering unease that settled in the pit of my stomach. I decided not to tell anyone about the mysterious figure I had seen in the woods. Perhaps it was just a trick of the light, or my overactive imagination playing games with me. But a small part of me still couldn't help but wonder what I had truly witnessed that night. As we continued our journey towards Yellowstone National Park, I couldn't help but glance nervously into the forests we passed, my eyes searching for any hint of the shadowy figure. I tried to focus on the beauty of the landscape and the excitement of our adventure, but my thoughts kept returning to that chilling encounter. When we finally arrived at Yellowstone, the grandeur of the park's geysers, hot springs, and wildlife managed to temporarily distract me from my haunting experience. But as night fell over our campsite, I found myself wide awake, listening to the sounds of the forest and clutching my flashlight once again. As the years went by, The memory of that night gradually faded into the background of my mind, replaced by new adventures and experiences. But from time to time, as I lay in bed at night or walked alone in the woods, I would remember that eerie encounter and the fear that had gripped me so tightly. As an adult, I often look back on that road trip with mixed emotions. On one hand, it was a fantastic adventure filled with incredible memories that I will cherish forever. On the other hand, it was a chilling reminder of the unknown that lurks in the shadows of the world, waiting to be discovered. To this day, I'm still not sure what I saw in that dark, secluded rest stop in the middle of the woods. Was it a figment of my imagination, a human lost in the wilderness, or something far more sinister? I may never know the truth, but that eerie encounter has stayed with me, a constant reminder that there are mysteries in this world that we may never fully understand. In the end, that road trip to Yellowstone National Park not only provided me with a deeper appreciation for the beauty and wonder of the natural world, but also taught me that there are things beyond our comprehension lurking in the darkness. And as much as we may try to rationalize and explain away these encounters, sometimes the truth remains elusive, hidden in the shadows of our own fears and uncertainties. I used to work for a company that had another office 2 states over. Whenever we needed equipment or vehicles delivered, I volunteered to make the trip. This time, I was tasked with driving a big box truck that we had purchased used and was filled with equipment from the other office. Unfortunately, there was a delay in getting a copier machine that we needed to take with us. The morning I was scheduled to take off, the machine didn't arrive until almost 3 p.m. After loading it in the truck and getting ready to take off, I knew I was going to hit rush hour traffic, so I opted to delay my leave for 2 hours, so it would be after 5 p.m. My plan was to drive through the night, stopping at rest stops to fuel up and take breaks. As a seasoned driver, I was used to making these long trips, but I knew the night could be tricky, especially when driving through rural areas. As expected, the first few hours of driving were uneventful. I made a couple of stops at rest stops, took breaks, and kept going. However, as the night wore on, I found myself driving through a dark and desolate area. The moon was up, but it was a cloudy night, so the light was not enough to make the area seem less creepy. I knew there was a last stop rest stop near the border, so I decided to pull over there to use the restroom, stretch my legs, and maybe rest for a few minutes before moving on. So I pulled up to the rest stop and it was empty. The rest stop was well lit, and I was in pretty good shape, so I wasn't worried too much about my safety. I used to box, so I felt confident that I could defend myself if necessary. I went to the restroom and washed up a bit, but when I made it back to my truck, there was a pickup truck parked next to it. The driver started making small talk with me before asking if I was having any mechanical problems with my truck. I found the question odd, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I answered that my truck was running fine and that I had no issues with it. I got back into my truck and continued driving. There was a long stretch ahead that was mostly a forest-like area, which made me feel even more uneasy. I was preparing myself for what was to come, knowing that the next few hours could be the most dangerous part of the trip. Then I saw a bridge up ahead, a long bridge that I knew from experience went over a gorge and water. It was the most challenging part of the drive. Suddenly, all the lights in my truck turned off: headlights, instrument lights, running lights, and even the brake lights. I tapped on the brakes and looked behind me, but even the brake lights seemed to be out. I felt a sense of panic rising inside me, but I managed to keep it together. I knew that panicking would only make things worse. Thankfully, it was a moonlit night, so I could gauge what was ahead of me. I slammed my fist on the dashboard and yelled, "Damn truck!" in frustration, and just as suddenly, everything came back on. I breathed a sigh of relief and continued driving, looking for a place to stop. However, there was nothing in sight. I kept driving, hoping to find a gas station or a motel, but the darkness and the desolation were making it almost impossible to see anything. I remembered a gas station that I had stopped at before, about 10 miles up the road, and decided to head there. As I pulled into the gas station, the same pickup truck that had been parked next to my truck earlier pulled over nearby. My unease started to grow as I watched the driver get out of his truck and walk around. I tried to ignore him, and focused on fueling up my truck. I kept looking over my shoulder, hoping that he would leave soon. Just as I was about to get back in my truck and drive on, a cop car pulled into the station. I waved at the officer and made small talk before pointing back in the direction of the pickup truck. After the officer drove off, I asked him about the road conditions and if there was a motel or something ahead. Feeling increasingly paranoid, I decided to pull off for the night and found a motel in a slightly larger town nearby. I locked up my truck, grabbed my bag, and kept looking around me as if expecting something to happen. I barely slept, waking up every few minutes and looking out the window. The next morning, I checked out of the motel, ate breakfast, and hit the road. I eventually made it to my office and had the truck looked at by a mechanic. However, the mechanic found nothing wrong with the truck, and my company never experienced the same issue again. Looking back, I still wonder what really happened that night, and if that guy had something to do with it. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that someone was out to get me. It made me think about all the dangers that come with long-distance driving, especially at night. It's easy to let your guard down, to become complacent when you've driven for hours on end. But, as I learned, you can never be too careful. There are people out there who will take advantage of any opportunity to cause harm or steal something valuable. As a result of that experience, I made a point to always be aware of my surroundings and take extra precautions when driving long distances. I made sure to check my truck thoroughly before hitting the road, including the lights, brakes, and tires. I also made sure to plan my route carefully, making sure to stop at well-lit rest stops or gas stations along the way. In the end, that experience taught me a valuable lesson. Long-distance driving can be dangerous, especially at night, but with the right precautions and a little bit of luck, you can make it to your destination safely. It's always better to be safe than sorry, so don't take unnecessary risks when you're out on the road. I remember it vividly, the road trip that I'll never forget. Every summer and New Year's, it was a tradition for our family to pack up the car and drive to Mexico to visit our relatives. The journey was always long but uneventful, until that one fateful trip when I was just 8 years old. As usual, we left our home in North Texas around 6 p.m. to reach our destination the next morning. The drive was long, and we would often pass the time by playing games, telling stories, or simply admiring the picturesque landscapes that surrounded us. This time, however, our drive was anything but typical. We crossed into Mexico around 2 a.m., and that's when things began to take a turn for the worse. Driving on a deserted freeway in the middle of the night, we didn't pay much attention to the car that had been following us for miles. It was nearly pitch black outside, the only visible shapes being the dotted stars above and the eerie silhouettes of the cacti standing like sentinels along the road. I remember lying across the back seat trying to sleep, but never quite managing it. Even in my semi-conscious state, I was aware of my surroundings, so when my mother suddenly spoke up, I heard her. "Miguel, that car behind us. It's been following us since we left Laredo." My father glanced at the rearview mirror and shrugged off my mother's tension. "A lot of cars use this road. He's probably going to Reynosa or another city." But he couldn't have been more wrong. Despite my father's dismissive response, my mother kept a wary eye on the car behind us. Her concern was contagious, and soon my siblings and I were also nervously watching the car through the gaps in the luggage, piled high in the back of our vehicle. It was a game, we told ourselves, to keep from feeling scared. But the game quickly lost its charm when the car started to close the distance between us. "He's getting closer," my mother noted with a tremor in her voice. We all turned to look as the car inched closer and closer to ours. "He's too close, Miguel." She was right. By this time, the car was practically pressed against the rear of our car, and on a lonely stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere, it was downright terrifying. My father, not wanting to provoke the other driver, maintained his speed and continued driving. The car followed, never straying from our tail. The next 30 minutes were the most tense we had ever experienced. The car, as we had come to think of it, would occasionally back off, only to press its blinding headlights against our rear once more. It was as if the driver knew he was freaking us out and was relishing the fear he instilled in us. It was during one of those brief periods when the car had pulled away that my mother spotted a police car up ahead, parked on the side of the road. She didn't miss a beat. "Pull over, right in front of the police. Pull over right now, Miguel." And he did. The car kept driving, disappearing into the darkness. I could only imagine how confused the police officer must have been as he watched my father park our car right in front of him. The officer approached our vehicle and asked what was wrong. My mother urgently explained everything, her voice cracking with fear. The car, the way it had followed us and taunted us, playing with our nerves like a cat with a mouse. The policeman took her claim seriously and told us of similar incidents where people had been victimized and had their cars stolen on these empty highways by thugs and criminals. He offered to drive behind us for a while, providing us with a sense of safety and protection. We gratefully accepted his offer and drove off, the reassuring sight of the police cruiser's flashing lights visible in our rearview mirror. Our hearts gradually slowed to a more regular rhythm as the immediate dangers seemed to have passed. We continued driving, the darkness of the night slowly giving way to the first hints of dawn. With the police officer still following us, our confidence grew, and we began to believe that the worst was behind us. But our relief was short-lived. About 10 minutes later, we saw the car again. It was parked on the side of the road, waiting for us like a predator stalking its prey. The sight sent a shiver down my spine, and I could feel the tension in the car thicken as we all realized that we hadn't escaped the danger after all. As we approached the car, the police officer turned on his siren, and we watched with a mix of fear and hope as he pulled up alongside it. The officer got out of his cruiser, cautiously approaching the vehicle with his hand resting on his gun. My father slowed down but did not stop, as we all held our breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The officer shone his flashlight into the car, illuminating the face of the driver. To our surprise, it was a man who appeared to be in his late 20s, his face a mixture of confusion and fear. He raised his hands in surrender, and the officer carefully opened the driver's door, guiding him out of the car. As we continued to drive, my father kept a close eye on the unfolding scene in the rearview mirror. We could see the officer questioning the man, who seemed to be protesting his innocence. After several minutes, the officer escorted him back to his cruiser and handcuffed him before placing him in the back seat. The police officer then returned to the car, conducting a thorough search. We didn't know what he found, but after some time he got back into his cruiser and followed us once more. This time, however, he had the car's driver in custody. We never found out the true intentions of the man in the car, but with the police officer's assistance, we made it safely to our relative's home in Mexico. That road trip remains etched in my memory, a chilling reminder of the dangers that can lurk in the most unsuspecting places. From that day on, our family road trips to Mexico were never quite the same. We took extra precautions, always vigilant of our surroundings and the cars that shared the road with us. The fear we had experienced that night had left an indelible mark on us all, a scar that would never fully heal. But we also learned the importance of trusting our instincts and the value of the kindness and protection of others. It was a harrowing experience, but it ultimately brought us closer together as a family, united by a shared brush with danger on a dark and desolate highway in the heart of the Mexican desert. As these chilling tales come to an end, we are left to ponder the mysteries of the night and the shadows that lurk in the depths of our fears. What was the true intention of the man in the car? Was he a sinister figure preying on unsuspecting travelers, or merely a lost soul caught in the web of our paranoia? We may never know the answer, but one thing is certain: the darkness hides secrets we may never uncover. What about you, dear listeners? Have you ever experienced a spine-chilling encounter on a lonely road or a brush with the unknown? We invite you to share your own terrifying tales in the comments below, so that we may all revel in the thrill of the macabre. And if you've enjoyed this haunting journey, we beckon you to join our eerie gathering by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. In doing so, you'll gain passage to an endless crypt of spine-tingling stories. where every shadow hides a new horror and every corner reveals a fresh nightmare. So gather round, dear listeners, and let us delve deeper into the twisted corridors of fear. Welcome to our realm of terror, and remember, there's always room for one more.